Thanks for joining us today. I'm Mike DiStefano. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Colorado in the Skaggs School of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences, and I'll be the moderator for today. This program is produced in partnership with the CU Center for Bioethics and Humanities and the Skaggs School of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences. And in this Ethics in Pharmacy series, we aim to explore ethical challenges and opportunities in the field of pharmacy. And our topic today is ethical considerations in the use of psychedelics. And before we start, I want to note that our session today is in large part intended to be informative for pharmacists and pharmacists in training. This means that we take for granted that psychedelics will be used in a Western biomedicine context. But there are many who continue to raise serious and important concerns about the extent to which these substances ought to be adopted and commercialized by Western practitioners of biomedicine, especially given the very long history of their use within indigenous and spiritual communities around the world. So we hope to address some of these issues during this session, and we also welcome questions from the audience on this topic. So we have a fantastic lineup of panelists, and I'll just briefly introduce them. Fuller biographies will be posted in the chat if you're interested. So we have Dr. Stacy Fisher. She is a professor of medicine in internal medicine at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. We have Dr. Amy McGuire, the Leon Jaworski Professor of Biomedical Ethics and the Director of the Center for Medical Ethics and Health Policy at Baylor College of Medicine. And Dr. Kristen Spear. She's a co-founder and board director at the Psychedelic Pharmacists Association and the founder and owner of the Magic Mushroom Interaction Checker. So we'll now get to know them and this topic a little better with our first set of questions. So I just want to start with a couple of background questions. So first, what counts as a psychedelic, a quote psychedelic? And what are some of the disagreements around the scope and use of this term? And I'll just let anyone jump in here to start.
So I can kick us off as a good lawyer and say it depends. So there is disagreement about what counts as a psychedelic. There are a group of classic psychedelics that are typically sort of, if you're a purist, that's what you're talking about. And these are substances like psilocybin, LSD, DMT, that have particular effects on receptors in the brain. But people also very frequently will include like entactogens like MDMA in when they're talking about psychedelics. And then some people will expand out even further and talk about things like ketamine, which is more of an anesthetic. It has different properties. I typically don't include ketamine because it's regulatory and sort of from a policy perspective, it's quite different. And that's the angle that I'm addressing this at. But a lot of people will, because and it's currently FDA approved and legal. So ketamine is at least. So Stacy, I don't know if you have other thoughts on that from a medical perspective, but I think there's lots of disagreement.
Yeah, I think that just the way you classified that is really helpful in our discussion and thinking about it, as well as thinking about like regulatory pathways and where the evidence base is for each of these different kind of in those different categories and where the current research is going on. I think there's also, it's really an interesting question around thinking about like mechanism of action and how much we don't know about how these substances and why they work, where they work, and what they're doing, both at the kind of at the neuroscience level of the brain and at the psychological level.
Yeah, I'd have to agree as well. Even coming from the standpoint of the Psychedelic Pharmacists Association, we've kind of had to define what is that? What are we educating on? What are we considering a psychedelic versus not? And there's even debate as, some will consider cannabis a psychedelic as well. And I think depending on how you look at it, just like Amy and Stacy said, it can depend. And I think the answer could be that it remains debatable. But for our purposes, for example, the Psychedelic Pharmacists Association doesn't technically include cannabis within that definition. And that decision is primarily based on the fact that it's kind of got its own regulation model and it's got its own history, and we don't necessarily want to repeat some of the components that came out of that that landscape. So
if I can, Michael, just to jump in, I think it's worth noting that as we're having this conversation, we should be very sensitive to the fact that even the term psychedelic is a very Western term, and a use of these substances has existed for a very long time among Indigenous communities. They don't call them psychedelics; they call them plant medicines or spirit medicines, and they would think of they would have different lines that they would draw around what they consider plant or spirit medicine. So just the use of the term psychedelics, I think, is situating us within a particular framework and context.
I'll jump in with one more comment too. NIH has shown increasing interest in developing the scientific evidence base for some of these substances. So in a recent call that they put out specifically targeting, if you will, psychedelic medicines, they did not include and specifically would consider applications that included things like ketamine and cannabis as unresponsive to the call. And they were really interested in the development of some of what we're describing as more of the classical psychedelics.
Now, given this discussion we're having, is there a more inclusive or broader term that is more helpful, something like mind-altering substances, or because it seems like some of the ways these drugs perhaps, and these substances perhaps can be distinguished are in terms of their effects on the body, right? Hallucination versus dissociation, etc. Are there preferred terms or terms that either any of you prefer in your practice to use instead of psychedelics? Or is it just too
I think it
dependent on the
depends on the
context?
context, because in some contexts it's helpful to lump, and in some contexts it's helpful to split, right? So, I worry a little bit about doing too much lumping, which I think we have done. And we talk about all these substances as if they are the same thing, and they're really not. They have very distinct characteristics and properties and effects and all kinds of things. And so it can be dangerous sometimes, I think, to lump them together under any umbrella term and not have the nuance either in our approach to researching them, in our approach to integrating them into clinical practice, or in our approach to regulating them. But you're right that there are some common features, and I don't know, I can't think of a better term right now in terms of how we're using it in Western, medicine and Western culture. But I'm less worried about the exact language we use and more about like what we're doing to lump and split things and making sure that we have appropriate nuance where it's required.
I think that's such an important point, Amy. I think like as I'm a palliative care clinician in my clinical practice, and communication is so important. So saying the term and then defining what exactly we mean and what we're talking about in this context with this term, I think is going to be really important.
I think I'll add too that, just to round out what Amy was saying earlier, there are some Indigenous cultures that don't even like to say the word psychedelic, because to them, these are sacred beings. For ritual purposes, for ritual use. And the term psychedelic renaissance implies that we're rebirthing or re-acknowledging or relearning or finding something new again, whereas traditional cultures have been using and respecting and honoring these plants and fungi for millennia. And so Renaissance to them is often perceived as, or to Indigenous folks and traditional wisdom is really almost another form of appropriation. And they've known these things for a long time. They've known how to use them for a long time. And so even the word Renaissance is controversial.
It's a great point, Dr. Spear. Thank you for noting that. And So just more in terms of the background, and I'll try to use a few different words when discussing these substances, given this complexity. But what is the legal status of these various substances? So we could start with, S-ketamine or ketamine, but I'd be interested in just going over the landscape of what is legally available, what is not in this broad bucket of substances. And perhaps we could start with you, Dr. McGuire, again, as the lawyer.
Not your lawyer. Always have to say that. So, I mean, classic psychedelics in the 1970s got scheduled as Schedule I substances under the Drug Enforcement Agency and the Controlled Substances Act. So federally, they are illegal. MDMA joined that classification in the 1980s. And so MDMA is also federally illegal in the United States. There are different jurisdictional rules in other countries, and so there's more permissive laws in other countries around some or all of these substances. Ketamine and esketamine are the only two substances that have FDA approval for use, and that's why I treat them differently, because they're not, Schedule I substances. They're treated differently. They're available through different pathways, et cetera. So I think we're going to talk a lot about some of the efforts to legalize access to classic psychedelics and MDMA, as we've been talking about them, through the FDA pathway, but also through state regulation, which is really just a decriminalization pathway that doesn't make them federally legal, because they're still Schedule I substances, but changes sort of the access pathway at the state level. So again, I hate to keep saying this, but it is a complicated legal landscape currently. And there's different pathways that are kind of operating in parallel, and they're not always totally consistent with each other. So that's kind of an overview. I don't know if anybody has anything they want to add in terms of more detail or color.
I'd add to that, just a conversation in my field of palliative care. People talk a lot about the right to try and trying to access some of these through that process. I'm unaware of anyone who's successfully done that. And given the infrastructure and complicated nature of the therapy that has been to this point, as much as we know from the evidence base, the therapy that is linked to making these, to creating an effective response for patients, it seems like that pathway of right to try would be unattainable.
Yeah, and there's the right to try pathway at the state access level, and then there's the compassionate use pathway, which is very similar at the FDA federal level. So, but I agree with you that both of those are mechanisms that I think people have looked to prior to FDA approval. And yeah.
I think as far as where we're going, over a year ago, approximately a year and a half ago, I think, before the FDA made any decision on MDMA, there was a conversation between the Psychedelic Pharmacist Association board, and at the time it was MAPS Public Benefit Corporation before they turned into Lykos. And we had a conversation with them to understand the role of the pharmacist when products were approved, when MDMA or even psilocybin were approved. Where within the current medicalized pathway would pharmacists be involved? Would we be dispensing at the counter? And I think it's useful to understand that where companies like Lykos and perhaps like Compass Pathways might be going is wrapping these substances around a pretty hefty REMS program, just like with S-ketamine, for example, which is brand Spravato. And their thought is that generally speaking, for the substances that impart a hallucinogenic type effect, and similar effects. That these substances would probably require not only REMS, but also be what goes along with that is limited distribution and specialty pharmacy. So that's kind of where the discussion was left last time, was that these medications would more than likely be a specialty type drug and administered only in clinic. And so from a pharmacy standpoint, pharmacists would be involved in specialty, which we know there's a lot of services in specialty pharmacy and including education and mail order and so on. Although these substances probably wouldn't necessarily be mail ordered to your residence, for example. And then probably, not definitely, again, maybe Amy or Stacy might have input here, but last I understood, these substances would probably, once approved, the product, not the substance from nature, but the product would probably be approved at a Schedule 3. So that's just some insight to see where things might be going, and gives you a little bit of an idea where pharmacists might play a role. That said, there are companies out there trying to chemically modify and alter some of these compounds to remove some of the more risky psychological hallucinogenic effects. And if that's successful, we may see more of these dispensed in more of a retail community setting, like at the counter, potentially. So none of this is said and done or confirmed, but I wanted to kind of give some insight on what we might be seeing on the FDA approval landscape.
Kristen, that's really interesting. And I just wanted to also add, I think this also speaks to, as going back to our earlier question of how do we classify and think about these different compounds, I think one other distinguishing feature is the potential for abuse liability. And I think that our understanding is still evolving, but we've had a very public case of someone dying of in a ketamine related incident, taking well above the prescribed, and I'm talking about Matthew Perry. And then certainly part of that abuse liability was one reason among many that the FDA made their ruling against MDMA moving forward. And in the psilocybin space, I don't think they've seen that nearly as much.
So staying on this topic a little bit and trying to drill down more into what could be happening at the state and not the federal level. Dr. Spear, would you be able to describe a little bit about what's happening in Oregon and Colorado in terms of access to psilocybin?
Sure, I'll do my best. And this comes from my experience and perspective in the early days of rulemaking with the Colorado's Natural Medicine Health Act and rolling out the program, which, as we know, licenses are recently, just this year, being accepted. I think, well, I guess I will turn this back and say, what is the question I can help answer? Because there is so much going on in the landscape. And I will say that my experience has been focused more on safety and ethics related to like dosing and adverse effects from a pharmacist point of view, and even help drafting some of the screening criteria. But there's also some points we could make about the licensure requirements, or like high level dual licensure requirements in Colorado, which we may see soon in Oregon. But is there a more specific question I can help answer on this front?
Can I ask a question of you, Kristen?
Sure.
I'm curious from your perspective what you think the most meaningful differences are between Colorado and Montana's laws. I mean, not Montana, sorry, Oregon's law.
Somewhere up there.
From my standpoint, it's the approach in Colorado is more medicalized for sure. And in Oregon, it's an adult use service. And it's not as focused on therapy, so to speak, but therapy is often used as a term, which we could go into a whole different episode and webinar on some of that. But yeah, I think the biggest difference between Oregon's model and Colorado's model from a regulated access standpoint is Colorado is more of a hybrid that brings in not only personal use, but a medical or a therapeutic model where folks can come in and see a licensed facilitator who may also have a medical license or a therapist license, behavioral health license, and they are allowed to practice under their own scope. They're not allowed to practice outside of their scope, but when they can practice within their own scope, their own license, in addition to practicing facilitation, the separate license, I think that will impart significant benefit for folks who are coming to the program looking for therapeutic purposes versus Oregon. It's interesting how the model, you have a lot of folks who do need therapy who are coming in for therapeutic use in Oregon, but the facilitators having to delicately dance and skirt around a little bit in that they can't provide therapy. They're just providing adult use services and monitoring and facilitating that. Well, that's my view.
It's also, I think, my understanding that the Colorado program may, I think the rules are still kind of in flux, but may allow for certain cases of at-home use with the correct facilitation in place, but that this is not something being permitted currently in Oregon. Is that correct?
I'm a little rusty on the knowledge there, but I think you are correct. I think even Oregon has even gotten into a little bit of trouble. And please jump in, Stacy, Amy, if you have any insight here, but a little bit of trouble in that they're not allowing the use of these medicines for folks. They're restricting access for folks who are maybe on palliative services or end of life, for example. But here in Colorado, we're trying to learn from some of Oregon's mistakes in the past and trying to build out a robust but safe in-home model, maybe not just for palliative care and end-of-life use, but for those who might not be able to get out of their homes, like if they have a disability, for example. So I apologize, I can't speak to that much more robustly, but that is definitely another difference between the two programs is carving out the safe and effective and accessible in-home use.
Great. Let's move to some more, I guess, general ethical considerations around the use of these substances and how that might interact with FDA approval or not. So let's imagine, right, psilocybin or some other classical psychedelic, entactogen, et cetera, receives FDA approval. How will this impact access, right? Even with FDA approval, psychedelics may not be covered by all insurance programs. How expensive will these drugs, therapies be? And how can we help ensure equitable access for those who are likely to benefit in that type of environment?
So I can start maybe. So I think, how expensive they are is going to depend on how they get rolled out. So currently, most of the clinical trials that have been done in the United States have been done in the context of psychedelic assisted therapy. So there's protocols that are in place that require a certain number of preparatory sessions. There's dosing sessions that can last up to 8 hours. And then there's integration sessions that come after it. Importantly, I think for people to understand is that the FDA does not regulate the practice of medicine. So they don't actually regulate the therapy that might go along with a particular drug. They regulate drugs and drug products, and that's the limitation of their jurisdictional reach. And that's one of the issues with that FDA has, I think, is trying to understand how much of the effect of these drugs is can we be seen from the drug product itself versus from the therapeutic protocol that it's embedded within. And we haven't really done the research to understand that. And does it matter what type of therapy is being offered during those sessions and those sorts of things? So there's a lot of information that we need to get from there. The most expensive thing that I think that the thing that's going to cost the most is also depends on, I think in a large part, the REMS that come out alongside the drug product. So if the REMS say that you have to have 2 licensed MDs, for example, present during all dosing sessions, that's 8 hours of 2 MDs time, which is extremely expensive. That hasn't been what's been proposed. There have been looser, some people have proposed 1 licensed sort of clinician or therapist, may or may not be an MD, with 1 potentially unlicensed or a different type of license. So that's gonna affect very much the cost. I will say I've seen sort of 2 numbers on this that I think are helpful to see. In one publication, they talked about the cost of psilocybin assisted psychotherapy, and estimated that the cost would be somewhere between like $7,500 to $9,600, depending on the cost of the drug, the psilocybin itself. And then I think there was a publication that talked about how much the phase 3 trial of MDMA cost. And in that publication, they reported that it was more than $11,000 per participant for that trial. So I don't know if that gives us a sense of how much the cost of this is going to be. Of course, also, there's this tension because the more highly regulated this becomes, potentially the safer it is, but also the more costly it becomes. So the more regulatory hurdles you have to go through, the higher the expense will be. So it's gonna be fairly costly and difficult for people to access these therapies if insurance companies are not covering them for particular indications. And this is where I think those parallel pathways of access are going to come into play, and people are going to seek out treatment in other parallel pathways, either through states, through medical tourism in other countries where there's more permissive legislation, or through things like at-home personal use in the unregulated setting.
I guess I would just add in, my hope is that at some point that we can continue to work through some of the really important questions around the research and evidence gaps to understand how much therapy is needed, because the trials that are ongoing, it's about nearly 24 hours of psychotherapy. In our current trial, we have a licensed provider and an unlicensed provider, but someone who has significant experience within the kind of mental health, palliative care space, that are both that are forming a therapy dyad that are present throughout. So that is a very costly thing. So in addition to understanding some of the therapy models and what dose of therapy, if you will, is also effective, I think other delivery models have been explored and need to be continued to, I think, ongoing research in them. A group model, for instance, for delivery of some of the dosing is something that could really increase the cost effectiveness. And then cost effectiveness studies, because if with this combined approach of therapy, single dose administration, and therapy, we're able to resolve some of these depression, anxiety, PTSD that are incredibly costly to the healthcare system and significantly impact people's quality of life, then we may be able to make that demonstrated case that even though this may be costly, it makes sense to do.
Yeah, and one of the things that's a really important point, Stacy, because one of the things that I think people are so excited about with psychedelic assisted therapy is that it seems, and we don't have, I think, sufficient long-term follow-up data to really understand this, but it seems that these can be effective with as little as 1, 2, 3 doses. And so it may be a high upfront cost to go through the treatment, but if it sort of negates the need for somebody to be on lifelong drugs, that could be comparatively cost effective. So I think we need to understand better the long-term effects and whether you need to sort of revisit this and get the treatment every couple of years or how often, and then also do that very important comparative cost effectiveness research.
Yeah, that's a great point about the potential for cost offsets, and gets at one of the difficulties of drug approval, development and approval in general, is that the longer you want your clinical trials to be to show that durability or not over time, the longer it takes for patients to potentially get access to these substances. And there's always the potential to do real world studies, but those are difficult, and you know they're they're hard to conduct well. Just staying on this topic of access, so absent FDA approval, right, or absent equitable coverage of these substances in the future, some patients may be driven to access psychedelics outside the healthcare system, either through state-sanctioned programs like in Colorado or Oregon. And again, taking the point that the Colorado model does involve this sort of healthcare aspect to it, but the Oregon model does not so far. So either through those state-sanctioned programs or through participation in psychedelic retreats, which I'm sure many of our attendees may have heard about, right? And I think this is what Dr. McGuire was speaking of when she talks about medical tourism. So will these pathways provide more affordable access to patients? And what are some of the ethical concerns with patients seeking treatment through those pathways?
So, so we recently completed it, or we're completing a study right now where we looked at 300 different retreat organizations that are advertising in English, and that are accessible to English-speaking consumers. So they are out there. People are using them already. I don't think they're going to stop using them. I think once we have FDA approval. In fact, I think they're only gaining in popularity and in sort of what the offerings that are out there. They are also, they're not cheap, but there's tremendous variability. We found huge variability in what's being offered. And many of these are being done through medical tourism, but a lot of them are being held in the United States in just an underground type of setting. That's not, I don't know if you like that word or not, but like in a way that's just unregulated. In all of the states of the United States, not just in Oregon and Colorado. They're being held, in people's backyards, and they're being held in very sophisticated, organized sort of programs, either here or abroad. They vary in how much they cost, from the average of a one-day retreat costing a couple $100s to week-long or 2-week retreats, the average being about $3,500, to we found some sort of quote-unquote luxury retreats that were being offered for up to $150,000. So it really, really depends what you're buying. And a lot of people have expressed interest in this. There was recently, I think last week, a 60 Minutes on one of the retreat programs that offers Ibogaine in Mexico, that I think Anderson Cooper was hosting. And so it's gotten a lot of attention in the popular press. And I think a lot of people have gotten very interested in, how do I find a retreat? What's a good retreat? What's a safe retreat? And we need a lot more consumer information out there, because there is such variability in practice, and lots of variability in some of the ethical practices as well, in terms of whether they screen for underlying medical conditions before you participate in a retreat, or not, and what they screen for, and what's an exclusion criteria, what's not. Do they require medication washout? So a lot of the retreats that we looked at, almost all of them actually, that we spoke to, require some form of medication washout. If you're on an SSRI or something, they require you to go off of it before you participate in the retreat. And that could range anywhere from being off of it for a day, just don't take it that morning, to more than 6 weeks. And it's very unclear sort of what those guidelines are based on. Many of them offer polysubstance use on retreat. So you may go on a retreat and be using more than one psychedelic substance on the retreat. You could be getting, ayahuasca in the evening and San Pedro during the day, and that may repeat. I've heard of several retreats where they do that and they repeat multiple days in a row, which carries a whole set of risks that we don't fully understand. There's a lot of variability in whether they have emergency protocols in place and what those might look like. And then also with regard to the integration, we talked about how important both preparation and integration is, we think, to the psychedelic therapeutic experience. And there's a lot of variation on retreat in terms of what it means to have integration, what those integration practices look like, et cetera. So, lots and lots is being offered. I think people see a big opportunity here. There's a huge increasing demand because of the excitement around some of the research that's going on. It will increase access because you can get access to these things outside of the medical model, and you don't have to have a particular medical indication to get a prescription, for example. But with that might come increased risks if you don't know what you're signing up for.
I think I'll add to, I would say that it's important for pharmacists to learn about these substances, even though they're not FDA approved. You don't have a product label to look at. And that's difficult. That's really challenging. But we really need to do our best as harm reduction experts to be able to inform folks what are the potential effects and what are the potential drug interactions? What should we look out for? I know this probably dives into, I think, what one of our next points might be, Michael. I apologize for maybe jumping the gun a little bit here, but pharmacists are going to be critical as very accessible members within the healthcare community for high-level information and harm reduction. A lot of people out there they're brand new, and I've seen on Facebook threads, for example, folks who are brand new wanting to do MDMA and psilocybin together for the first time, like ever experiencing a psychedelic trip. And you'll have an entire community of people who are saying, yeah, this can be really effective because, MDMA might reduce your fear and open you up a little bit more to the effects of psilocybin. And I do it this way before taking psilocybin. And I would just encourage pharmacists to become knowledgeable about the mechanisms of these substances enough and the effects to give some advice. I think our culture has a problem with disrespecting drugs, disrespecting compounds, even disrespecting ourselves and others. And I think this all comes into play. There's this level of maybe false comfort with psychoactive substances that I think we need to challenge and bring to light a little bit. Maybe not try to at once for the first time. And if you were to do that and you happen to be on a serotonergic medication or a couple of them, or you're taking a benzodiazepine for anxiety, and there's all these things from medications and drug interactions that are, for the most part, completely being ignored on social media. I would even say even in research. So I think from the pharmacist standpoint, that putting in or inserting a little bit of just start low, go slow, common sense, especially for folks who are naive to the substances, probably starting with 2 at once may not be the best. There's a lot of variables there. And I think we also need to challenge the thought that there are no drug interactions with some of these substances that folks have been using and trying for years. I could go off on a tangent on that, but I won't for our purposes today. But I think those are two key ways for pharmacists to be involved and educate and provide harm reduction for folks who are curious, asking questions, or even if you're involved in like a social media group. So
just to build off that, I think when I think about the FDA guidance that is not only informing our clinical trial, but many of the INDs in this space, for instance, for psilocybin, the threshold for risk is very, very, like, they don't want any risk. So our blood pressure, our maximum blood pressure is 140/90. So if someone comes in the morning and we can't get a reading out of 3 readings that's below 140, they don't dose that day. Checking EKGs, checking lab work, extensive family history, extensive psychological screening. And I work, Kristen, to your point, hand in hand with our amazing investigational pharmacy, Dr. Jackie Bainbridge, to like figure out, okay, they're taking this, is this going to be okay? Or when do they need to stop this medication, to really allow all the half-lives to be, to make sure that they have negligible serum levels by the time they go in for dosing. And so those kinds of questions, I think, are really, really important, especially as people are considering other pathways beyond like right now, a clinical trial or regulated use.
Yeah, this suggests a follow-up for me to your research, Dr. McGuire. So how often did you see whether these retreats or various experiences have, a clinician or pharmacist potentially on staff or involved in the intake of patients to ensure, right, these proper drug washout periods are being observed or the drug-to-drug interactions are being considered?
Yeah, so we did find that some of them had some medical personnel either on staff or present at the retreat, but it was not clear because we were looking primarily at publicly available information and we did some interviews, but it wasn't clear what their role was, right? So some of them may actually have been participants on the retreat. And it wasn't clear sort of from the data that we collected what role they had and whether they were the purpose of them being on staff was to respond to adverse events or what that protocol was if there was an adverse event.
So I do want there to be time for some audience questions, but maybe 1 or 2 more questions before then. So what might we expect from the new administration regarding regulation of these compounds or enthusiasm for their use in biomedicine?
I'll start. I think there's a lot of unpredictability, I think would be fair to say, with the current administration. Now, I think it's very likely that we'll see this week that Robert Kennedy Jr. will be confirmed as Secretary of Health and Human Services, and he has been very public about his support for psychedelics in general. Now, whether that means, and I think there are a number of pathways that could take, and I think I'm going to turn to Kristen and put you on the spot because you really outlined it really beautifully in our pre-game conversation. But so I'm curious, my hope is that there will be increased funding for science to try to answer some of these really vital questions around the role of therapy, cost effectiveness, and pushing the boundaries of safety to where we really where we're not so constricted by who is able to access these, that we have a broader understanding of their effectiveness.
I think what I can add to that too is, if for example, Kennedy tends to lean more pro psychedelics, but also tends to be maybe anti-pharma, for example. That's an interesting stance, and it probably brings more questions than answers at this point. But one way that could play out, for example, is, although I don't know if this would be very likely, but descheduling or rescheduling, or descheduling, not just the FDA product, but also the substance, the natural substance itself that's currently Schedule 1. So right now, a lot of substances and FDA approved products, I should say a lot of currently illegal Schedule 1 substances and FDA approved products that come from them, like THC-based medications, Epidiolex, for example, or Marinol, for example. The product itself is not a Schedule 1, but it contains a federally Schedule 1 substance, for example, and that substance alone outside of a product is Schedule 1, as we know. So if someone like Kennedy or the new administration has this kind of stance, we may, for example, see a descheduling of potentially both the product and the illicit substance, if that makes sense. I think we'll see huge pushback from pharmaceutical companies if that's the route that's taken. And I don't know what the likelihood of anything like that might be, but it's also currently a problem to access is this bifurcated scheduling. So where you do have a substance that's Schedule 1, and then you have a product that's Schedule 2 or 3, and it reduces access to the substance for people who can't access it via the medical route, right? The medicalized pathway or insurance, for example. So it may effectively eliminate bifurcated scheduling, for example. Again, that's just one play out. I don't know what the chances of that might be, but if that could be an interesting thing to watch, to see.
And I'll just add that I think it's been really interesting and remarkable how much bipartisan support there is for, and has been even prior to the Trump administration, for psychedelic research and therapy. And a big part of that is because a lot of the early trials have been on veteran populations that are, suffer tremendously from PTSD and suicidality, a very important population. The veteran community has been huge advocates for psychedelic drugs, and it's really brought bipartisan support where you might not think that there would be allies for pushing this forward to the forefront. And, as somebody who resides in Texas, I can tell you it's really interesting. We have, our former governor, Rick Perry, is one of the most vocal sort of proponents of pushing forward ibogaine research for veteran health in the state of Texas. And there's been quite a bit of support for that. So it's been really interesting to see.
Thanks. I want to move to some audience questions, unless Dr. Fisher, were you about to say something? No, okay.
Go ahead.
So I think, Dr. Spear, earlier you mentioned, I believe, this prospect of developing some drug candidates that don't have these hallucinogenic effects as a idea, the idea being you can perhaps eliminate some of the risks of these drugs. And we have a question from the audience that gets to this topic. So if the psychedelic effects or the hallucinogenic effects, let's say, are removed, how does that impact the drug's efficacy? Like how central to the drug's efficacy are those hallucinogenic or psychedelic effects?
That's an excellent question, and it's a big debate right now. And I imagine both Amy and Stacy will have input on this as well. But real high level, because I know we're running out of time, I will say that there's a big question, and we don't know at this time how much the experiential hallucinogenic piece contributes to the therapeutic outcome versus the neuroplastic piece. the biological neuroplastic effects on your neurons with creating new connections or even creating new neurons. How much of both of those is required for the therapeutic outcome? There's a camp that believes it's probably not as important to have the hallucinogenic or experiential effect to get the therapy. And another camp believes it's absolutely required and you need both. So I'll leave it at that and open it to Stacy or Amy if you want to comment.
I'll just chip in that we're studying things like mystical experience and these psychological mechanisms in our current trial. And so I think these are great questions to ask. And again, just highlighting the role that we need such better science in this space.
I want to add to that. I keep forgetting to mention that, a lot of the therapeutic benefit is thought to be derived from this mystical experience, as Stacy mentioned, and feeling one with the universe, right? Or meeting a spiritual entity, versus the hallucinogenic piece, which may or may not be part of that, right? But I would say that could be, who knows whether we could tease those effects out, or even whether they're necessary to tease out from the experience or even chemically modify out. Who knows? But it's a great question, and I just don't think we have the answer to it yet.
So another audience question, and this is more specific to Colorado. So what are some of the ethical challenges that can arise for healthcare professionals in Colorado where, let's say, psilocybin use will be legal under certain contexts for, quote, medical purposes? Is the evidence base there to support this medical use or therapeutic use for psilocybin? And, if not, how should practitioners be approaching the practice?
Well, at this point, I would cautiously say there is strong emerging evidence that this is effective in a major depressive disorder, in anxiety and demoralization associated with serious advanced illness. I think those are, and certainly PTSD. I think those are some spaces where there is a good, and is it definitive? No, it is not. But I think strong enough to support that. I think where practitioners, anyone, and this came up over the weekend at the American Academy of Hospice and Palliative Medicine meeting, where there are a lot of folks that see these potentially promising therapies and want to get involved. And the fact is, any of us who practice at a place that has received federal funding, this isn't something that they're going to be able to bring into their practice. Where I do think that we're going to see is more ongoing integration work. And so patients who may seek it out in the community, but come back to their, say, palliative care clinician or psychologist or psycho-oncologist to receive ongoing support and therapy as they continue to integrate these experiences.
I think that's absolutely right, Stacy. And I think, clinicians, all kinds of clinicians really need to be prepared for that. Their patients are going to increasingly be asking their advice. I want to seek this out. What do you think? They're going to say, I did seek this out and I want you to help me make sense of it. They're going to say, I plan to do this, but I have to get off of my other medications. Can you help me do that? I mean, there's all kinds of ways in which our current sort of licensed healthcare providers are going to get integrated into this system even prior to FDA approval.
Coming to the close, I wanted to just save a few minutes to give each of the panelists an opportunity to have a final word, if they'd like. Summarize this entire very complex topic for us, please, in a pithy statement, if you will. We'll start with Dr. Fisher. You're top left for me here.
Okay. I always lean back on my little adage, what do we want? High quality science. When do we want it? After peer review. And I think this is such an exciting time to be part of be part of it. What we know is that tip of the iceberg, and what we don't know is all the kind of that huge ice flow beneath the surface. And I think this is there is tremendous opportunities for growth and scientific exploration where we can really improve the lives of patients.
I think I can't really summarize, and we never have enough time. I think we could spend an entire week or more talking about this, but I think I want to leave the audience and the pharmacists and the pharmacy students who might be attending here with one perspective. And I think that is that, yes, pharmacists are the medication experts, the drug experts, the pharmacotherapy experts. We definitely have a role in this place, but I would also challenge folks to think about the other kind of experts and wisdom brought to this medicine, to this field of practice, if you will. There's a lot to be learned from folks who've been using these substances and sacred medicines for a long, long time. And I just challenge everybody to be open. There's so much unknown, and there's such a drive for people to be the person in the know, to educate others. And I think, yes, there's room for that, but I think we also need to be more open from learning from other experts and folks who can bring a lot of practical wisdom and knowledge to our own training as pharmacists, as providers, even other clinicians. There's a lot of opportunity to learn from each other, and I think we need to do that.
And I think both of you kind of anticipated what I was going to say, because I think there are two sort of driving ethical virtues or principles that I think of when I think of this space. And one is preventative ethics. Like, we really need to kind of not be reactive. We need to be preparing our healthcare system for what I think is the inevitable adoption of this in a variety of different ways. And the second is epistemic humility. And I couldn't agree with you more, Kristen, that we think we know what we know. Our entire conversation today has been framed around and within the context of our own worldviews. And there are many, many people out there who have very, very, very different worldviews, who have used these medicines forever and think about them quite differently, think about their relationship to them and with them quite differently. And having some epistemic humility in order to account for all of those different perspectives and acknowledging that we only know what we think we know is I think, really important as we move forward.
Thank you. Yeah, these are very excellent thoughts to conclude on. I also want to thank the audience today for showing up. We really appreciate your attendance at these events, and we hope to see you at our future events later this year. Please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.
Thank you, guys. Good to see you.
So great to be on this panel with you both. Thank you. And Michael, thank you for excellent facilitation.
Of course. All right, take care, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.